Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here, and I'd like to address some themes that are currently occurring in various protests around the world. First, I'd like to go ahead and mention that while we can compare and contrast these protests, they are very, very different. In some cases, we have very peaceful protests, and in other cases we have the other end of the extreme, which is violence, leading possibly to even massacres. And so in order to try to understand these protests, I think it's important to narrow down the specific protest we're looking at and many of the group dynamics that are occurring. I don't believe we can adequately say that this protest is like that protest and so on and so forth, as you have seen done in the media quite frequently. There are worlds of differences between these protests, and there's a lot of sub-protests going on within any specific protest. Well, why do people protest? That's probably the first question that we would want to address, and of course there's multiple reasons. If you asked anyone who was at a protest why they were there, they may even have multiple reasons as well. Now, Lonnie Athens, in his work on violent crimes and violent criminals, discusses a concept that he terms the phantom community, which, to quote Lonnie Athens, provides people with a multi but unified voice and sounding board for making sense of their varied social experiences. And I think that may be a key to understanding the protests. We want to go ahead and first be able to develop some typology of groups within a specific protest, and then we want to identify their phantom community. We want to identify the people that they look towards for leadership. We want to look at the people that they use as their sounding board, as their encouragement for their behaviors and interactions. The groups that reinforce, or the smaller groups that reinforce larger groups. So we want to try to understand then the motivating factors behind these particular groups. And we also want to note that when there is protest and then there are changes that occur, and some changes occur more rapidly than others, there may be vacuums, spaces where there is complete disorganization and chaos, which may put a community at greater risk for violence. And I think it is important to also recognize the uncertainty that we have about particular groups. It seems one day one group are our friends, and the next day they're our enemies, and that may or may not make sense unless there was a drastic change in one group or the other, or in policy. But I think we want to clearly find out if there are any groups in charge, or is this a leaderless protest, as some would say, or are there subgroups with various leaders, some having identified leaders, others being leaderless. And so I really think that if we were going to conduct an analysis of these protests, it would be extremely relevant to have ethnographic work done, to have, for example, anthropologists or sociologists or criminologists interviewing a variety of protesters at random, and then trying to develop some themes to develop group typologies, what types of groups that they would be identified with, and their phantom communities, who they look towards for recommendations, advice, and actions. I think that's relevant and very important to do. I don't think it's helpful just to choose someone off the street, interview them, and then think that not only have we chose someone randomly, but then that person may represent the whole protest population. I mean, for example, in my community, we had Fashion Week last week, and I walked down the street going to get something to eat, and the media was there, and I thought, what a tragedy that would be if one of the media representatives pulled me aside and started to talk about fashion, something I know nothing about. that would be a terrible injustice to the fashion industry, and it would also lead to some very erroneous conclusions if they started to ask my opinion about fashion, about what was going on there, what I liked, what I disliked, how I made sense of things. That would not be an appropriate situation. The same thing can occur in the media when we see one person pulled aside and ask them questions. And there certainly may be other motivating factors for particular responses, and with a camera pointed on someone in a hostile situation, they may say some things that they think are socially appropriate rather than risk saying what's really on their mind and having negative consequences. So I really think we need to spend a lot more time carefully analyzing and assessing what is actually going on in each specific protest, and then come up with a methodology to look at these protests, and to also realize that they may change very rapidly, and to account for that. And then we might be able to do a better analysis of comparing these protests, and maybe even coming up with different scenarios of where these protests may go. We may come up with the best scenario possible, of course from our own view, and the worst case scenario, and then some scenarios in between, some more likely perhaps than others. And we also can use these ideas if we are to try to prevent violence from occurring in any of these protests. If we have an understanding of the dynamics, we may be able to utilize scarce resources more appropriately to prevent violence, or to try to intervene in early stages of violent behavior to prevent escalation of violence, massacres, and other violent activities that could lead to great destruction. And this wraps up this brief overview. Good day or good night.